Mary Angela Kelly, LVO, is a British fashion designer, dressmaker, and milliner who has served as personal assistant and senior dresser to Queen Elizabeth II since 2002.
She wasn't born into royalty, didn't marry into it, and never sought the spotlight. Yet Angela Kelly became the Queen's closest confidant.
She fights back tears and loads up a van with her treasured belongings, bidding adieu to her home in Windsor. But it was her enigmatic Instagram post that truly had people talking.
For over 25 years, she stood just behind the throne, silently shaping how the world saw Queen Elizabeth II. But what really happened behind palace doors? What secrets did Angela witness that no one else did? From personal pranks to historic decisions, this is the untold story of loyalty, humor, and the woman who dressed the most powerful figure in Britain. Angela Kelly was born in 1957 in a working-class neighborhood in Liverpool. She was the daughter of a crane driver and a nurse and grew up in council housing. Her accent, distinct and unmistakably Scouse, remained part of her identity even after she began working inside the walls of Buckingham Palace. Throughout her career, it set her apart, often seen as a reminder of her roots, especially in a world where class and presentation often shaped people's perceptions. Before joining the royal household, Angela's path was anything but glamorous. She worked as a housekeeper and was stationed at the British Embassy in Berlin in the early 1990s. That role might not sound like the most direct route into royal service, but it became the turning point of her life. In October 1992, Queen Elizabeth II and Prince Philip visited the Berlin Embassy as part of a diplomatic visit. Angela was on duty that day, and though many might have been starstruck, she wasn't. Instead, she had a brief, casual conversation with the Queen. During that short exchange, she mentioned her plans to return to England soon. What happened next was unexpected. A few months after that brief encounter, Angela received an invitation that changed everything: an offer to join the royal household. In early 1993, she began working as one of the Queen's dressers. At that time, her role was relatively modest, involving day-to-day clothing assistance and wardrobe care. But it didn't take long for Angela to stand out. Within 3 years, she was promoted to senior dresser, a significant step up in responsibility and visibility. The promotion came shortly after the death of Bobo MacDonald, the Queen's lifelong dresser and one of her most intimate companions since childhood. Bobo's passing left a gap not just in the Queen's staff, but in her personal life as well. Stepping into that space required more than professional competence. It required emotional intelligence, patience, and trust. Angela had no official training in royal protocol, high fashion, or public image management. What she did have was a strong work ethic, a sharp eye for detail, and the kind of loyalty that can't be taught. She didn't just lay out clothes or choose fabrics. She listened, she learned, and she observed everything around her. Slowly but surely, she built a reputation as someone who could be relied upon, not only for the Queen's wardrobe, but for her discretion and support. In a world defined by hierarchy and rules, Angela became a quiet exception. Over time, her role evolved into something much more personal. The Queen trusted her, and that trust allowed Angela to move into living quarters within the palace itself. She became a daily fixture in the Queen's life, seen not just in public preparations, but behind closed doors. As Angela herself once said in an interview, "I love the Queen and everything about her. She has allowed me to get close to her, and she has trusted me for a long time." That relationship between a monarch and a member of staff wasn't typical. Angela's closeness to the Queen eventually led to her receiving a new title: personal advisor and curator to Her Majesty, jewelry, insignias, and wardrobe. It was more than just a fancy job description. It was recognition of the unique space she had carved out in royal service. Angela had become the person responsible for some of the Queen's most public-facing choices: what she wore, how she looked, and how that look connected with audiences across the globe. Angela's job included selecting the right outfit for each occasion, from royal visits and receptions to public holidays and international events. But it was never about fashion for fashion's sake. Every color, every accessory, every fabric choice carried meaning. Her work went far beyond matching coats and hats. It was about symbolism, legacy, and the subtle language of public image. What set Angela apart wasn't just her rise through the ranks, it was how she did it. People inside the palace reportedly described her as no-nonsense, direct, and completely dedicated to the Queen. She didn't seek the limelight. In fact, she operated largely out of it, often seen just a few steps behind the Queen during major public events, rarely speaking, always observing. Over the years, the Queen came to value not only Angela's practical skills, but her sense of humor and natural warmth. They shared inside jokes. They had quiet conversations away from the cameras. And they understood each other in a way that only long-term working relationships allow. That bond grew even stronger through challenging times, like the death of Prince Philip and the isolation of the COVID pandemic, a period that would later reveal even more about the depth of Angela's commitment. But long before those defining moments, Angela was already building the foundation of her legacy, one that didn't come from privilege or pedigree, but from consistency, loyalty, and trust earned day by day. There's a reason why Angela's story drew attention when she finally decided to share it publicly. For most royal staff, silence is not just expected, it's essential. Rarely does anyone who serves the monarch speak out, let alone write a book. Yet Angela's memoir, which would come later, wasn't a tabloid-style exposé. It was something else entirely, a personal record of her life in service to someone she deeply respected. Angela's rise from embassy housekeeper to one of the Queen's most trusted confidants may seem improbable. But it's also a story rooted in very real human qualities. She wasn't perfect, she didn't pretend to be, but she showed up every single day for more than 2 decades, ready to serve, and more importantly, ready to understand the person behind the crown. What makes her story so compelling isn't just where she ended up, it's where she came from. In a space dominated by tradition and class, Angela proved that dedication and character could matter just as much as background or birthright. She represented something quite rare in the modern monarchy, the possibility that someone without royal blood or a famous surname could still play a pivotal role in shaping the image of a queen. By the time Angela had established herself as a permanent figure within the Queen's household, her responsibilities had grown significantly. She wasn't just laying out garments anymore, she was advising on colors, designing new outfits, managing jewelry selections, and coordinating ensembles for international visits and historical events. It was a job that combined creative design with diplomacy, cultural awareness, and personal understanding. Very few people were trusted to influence how the Queen of England presented herself to the world. Angela was one of them. Angela's influence became especially clear in the way she approached wardrobe planning. Outfits weren't chosen on a whim. If the Queen was scheduled to travel to a Commonwealth country in November, Angela was likely planning for it months in advance, sometimes as early as spring. The colors of an outfit had to be appropriate for the occasion. The cut of the coat had to work with the climate. The accessories had to suit local customs and traditions. And the Queen's comfort always came first. There was no room for last-minute decisions. Everything was planned meticulously, right down to the kind of fabric used and the exact shade of gloves. Angela developed a system that balanced tradition with practicality. That included managing the Queen's iconic hats, her brooches, and the footwear that accompanied every look. She even had a say in how to style the Queen's hair for different events, coordinating with other staff to make sure each appearance was flawless. In her 2019 book, The Other Side of the Coin, Angela explained that the bright colors the Queen often wore weren't just a preference, they were essential. When the Queen appeared at large public events, whether in a stadium, on a parade route, or at a crowded outdoor gathering, people needed to be able to see her. Vibrant yellows, soft purples, powder blues, these colors helped the Queen stand out in a sea of gray suits and black coats. It wasn't just about fashion, it was about visibility. As Angela explained, if someone came all the way from a remote village or waited hours just for a glimpse of the monarch, they deserved to see her clearly, even from the back of a crowd. Angela's approach to dressing the Queen also involved a deep appreciation for history. She often pulled out bolts of fabric that had been sitting in the royal archives for decades, some dating as far back as the 1960s. These weren't just old materials collecting dust. They were carefully preserved silks, brocades, and laces, still strong and beautiful. Rather than order something brand new every time, Angela would sometimes design an outfit using one of these older fabrics, giving it a fresh life. This wasn't just a nod to sustainability. It reflected the Queen's own belief in value and conservation. One of Angela's most touching revelations had to do with the Queen's shoes. Because the Queen was constantly on her feet at public events, she couldn't afford to wear uncomfortable or stiff new shoes. So Angela would break them in for her. She would wear the shoes around the palace corridors, walking in them until the leather softened just enough. No one had told her to do it. She just saw that it needed to be done. That kind of attention to detail wasn't common, and it wasn't showy, but it mattered. Her workspace inside the palace reflected that same organized, practical spirit. It wasn't filled with racks of the latest fashions or cluttered with accessories. It was structured like an archive. Every outfit was logged, stored with photos, fabric swatches, and handwritten notes. Angela made sure the Queen was never seen wearing the same outfit twice at a major event. But that didn't mean nothing was ever reused. In fact, Angela would often recycle pieces, tweaking a hemline, changing buttons, or adding a new scarf to refresh a look. The Queen's wardrobe was constantly evolving, just like her reign. One of the ways Angela stood out was in her method of presenting options to the Queen. She didn't give orders or finalize choices on her own. She would lay out a selection of brooches, hats, or scarves, and offer suggestions based on the event. The Queen would then make her own decisions. The process was collaborative, respectful, and based on years of mutual trust. Angela wasn't just a dresser, she was a key part of how the Queen shaped her public image. And that image wasn't always reserved or traditional. One of the most unexpected moments in the Queen's long public life came during the opening ceremony of the 2012 London Olympics. Billions of people around the world tuned in, expecting British pageantry and some clever theatrical flourishes. What no one expected was for Queen Elizabeth to star in a short James Bond film. The scene began with actor Daniel Craig arriving at Buckingham Palace as James Bond. He's shown walking through the palace, being led to the Queen's private office. And there she was, Her Majesty herself, turning around from her desk and saying, "Good evening, Mr. Bond." Moments later, the two characters board a helicopter and appear to parachute into the stadium. While a stunt double completed the jump, the Queen arrived in the royal box just seconds later to thunderous applause. The moment went viral. It wasn't just humorous, it was historic. What most people didn't know at the time was that Angela Kelly had played a major role in making that moment happen. When director Danny Boyle and his team pitched the idea to include the Queen in the scene, they assumed it was a long shot. Surely a monarch wouldn't agree to something so unconventional. But Angela knew the Queen well enough to recognize the opportunity. She'd seen flashes of the Queen's sense of humor, her love of surprises, and her willingness to modernize her image when the timing was right. Angela supported the idea. She helped shape how the Queen would appear in the video and made sure everything maintained the dignity expected of a monarch, even while breaking tradition. It wasn't about acting. It was about showing another side of the Queen, one that the public rarely saw. Angela gave her the confidence to go through with it. Another example of that personal dynamic came in a much smaller, more private moment. One April Fool's Day, Angela placed a stuffed kookaburra outside the Queen's window. It was an incredibly lifelike bird, so realistic that the Queen believed at first it might be a real visitor from Australia. When she realized it was a joke, she laughed, reportedly saying, "You're joking," before breaking into genuine amusement. That kind of playful interaction wasn't common within royal circles. But Angela had earned the right to cross that line. Those stories illustrate something that numbers and titles can't convey. Angela Kelly became one of the few people who could lighten the Queen's mood in tense moments, prepare her for events that carried enormous pressure, and offer gentle humor in the most formal of spaces. While her work was often invisible to the public, It was essential to the Queen's sense of presence and composure. And while Angela's role was clearly tied to fashion, her influence went much deeper. She helped maintain the Queen's consistency, her reliability in a world that often felt uncertain. Whether through color, detail, or tradition, Angela made sure the Queen sent the right message every time she stepped out in public. The significance of Angela's work wasn't just in the garments themselves. It was in the relationships she built, the consistency she offered, and the quiet loyalty she showed behind the scenes. Her influence on the Queen's image can't be separated from her personal connection to the monarch. And as the years went on, that connection would carry even more weight, especially during moments of crisis and change. Inside the palace, the usual rhythms of daily life were replaced with something far more stripped down. Gone were the large teams of staff, the formal dinners, and the carefully scheduled events. In their place was a small, isolated group of people who formed what came to be known as the HMS bubble. Around 20 members of staff, including housekeepers, chefs, and aides, stayed within the castle grounds, cut off from their own families and normal lives to protect the Queen and Prince Philip from the virus. Angela Kelly was part of that group. Her decision to join the bubble wasn't made lightly. It meant sacrificing personal time, distancing herself from her own loved ones, and committing to an intense and uncertain period of service. But for Angela, it wasn't just a professional obligation. It was personal. She had worked with the Queen for nearly 3 decades by then. She had been there for state banquets, foreign visits, and family milestones. Now she was there for something very different: the quiet, difficult months of complete isolation. Within the bubble, roles became more fluid. Angela, known primarily for her work with clothing and image, began taking on a wide range of new responsibilities. She wasn't just laying out outfits or advising on accessories. She became a companion, a housekeeper, and even a hairdresser when needed. There were no stylists or backup teams to call. Everything was done in-house, and Angela stepped up to fill whatever gap was required. In a brief comment made later in her memoir, Angela mentioned how she had styled the Queen's hair during lockdown, ensuring her familiar curls were in place for occasional video calls and portraits. It may sound like a small task, but it symbolized the all-hands-on-deck mentality that defined that time. The Queen, accustomed to an army of specialists, now relied on the same handful of people each day. Angela was one of the few constants in that suddenly quiet world. Life inside the bubble was not glamorous. The days were long, the routines repetitive, and the atmosphere often tense. Staff couldn't leave the grounds. They had to follow strict protocols to avoid any exposure to the virus. Yet, amid the stillness, something else developed: a deepened sense of trust between the Queen and those who remained by her side. Angela, already one of the most trusted figures in the Queen's personal life, became even more essential. The two women reportedly spent time together in the afternoons, sharing tea or simply enjoying each other's company in silence. These were moments that no press cameras captured, no official reports documented, and no titles could fully explain. They were human moments, quiet companionship in a time of global uncertainty. And then, in April 2021, came the most difficult moment of all. Prince Philip, the Queen's husband of more than 70 years, passed away at the age of 99. His death marked the end of an era, both for the monarchy and for the Queen personally. For decades, he had been her partner, her advisor, and her closest friend. His absence was not just a national loss, it was a deeply personal one. Angela was there behind the scenes during this time of mourning. She helped the Queen navigate the quiet days after his death, the preparations for the funeral, and the emotional toll that came with grieving in the public eye. While the image of the Queen sitting alone at Prince Philip's funeral became one of the most powerful photographs of the pandemic, it was the unseen support, people like Angela, who helped her through it in the background. There were no detailed accounts of those private days, but it's understood that Angela remained a steady presence throughout. She didn't speak publicly about the Queen's grief, nor did she describe any emotional scenes. But her continued loyalty and quiet presence spoke volumes. It was during these moments, away from the cameras and ceremony, that Angela's role became more than just professional. It was deeply personal. As the restrictions eased and the bubble began to dissolve, Angela returned to a more traditional routine. But something had shifted. The world was different. The monarchy had changed, and Angela herself had reached a turning point. Later that year, Angela released her memoir, The Other Side of the Coin. While she had written earlier versions under the Queen's supervision, this book felt different. It wasn't just a collection of anecdotes or behind-the-scenes glimpses into royal fashion. It was a reflection of her time with the Queen, including insights into what life had been like during the pandemic. She wrote about the isolation, the long days, the quiet companionship, and the ways in which life inside the palace had become unusually intimate. What made the book unusual was not its content, but the fact that it existed at all. Very few royal staff ever write about their experiences, and almost none do so while the monarch is still alive and reigning. But Angela had received the Queen's blessing. It was an unprecedented move. The Queen, known for her strong sense of privacy and adherence to tradition, had allowed Angela to speak, openly, respectfully, and honestly. That decision surprised many within royal circles. Some welcomed the openness. Others were unsettled. There had always been an unspoken rule. The palace does not reveal its private moments. Yet here was a senior aide, one who had lived and worked in the Queen's inner circle for decades, writing openly about their shared experiences. Angela's book wasn't scandalous. It didn't dig into palace politics or personal feuds. Instead, it focused on the relationship she had with the Queen, the trust they built over time, and the details of everyday life that most people never see. She wrote about how she prepared the Queen's clothes, how decisions were made, and how humor often softened even the most formal moments. The public response was largely positive. Readers appreciated the tone of the book, warm, honest, and grounded in respect. It wasn't tabloid material. It was something more personal. Angela shared memories that made the Queen feel more human, more relatable. She wrote about jokes they shared, the quiet rituals of palace life, and the surprising normality of some of their interactions. Of course, not everyone within the institution approved. Some senior figures reportedly felt that the book crossed a line, even if it had the Queen's approval. There were whispers that Angela had become too visible, too familiar to the public. But Angela remained clear. She wasn't revealing secrets. She was honoring the Queen in the best way she knew how, by sharing a glimpse of the woman behind the crown. For Angela, writing the book was never about fame. It was about documenting a part of royal life that often goes unseen. It was about showing the reality behind the ritual, the personal moments behind the public image. And in doing so, she added something rare to the royal story, a human perspective from someone who was close enough to see everything, but trusted enough to handle it with care. As the world slowly emerged from lockdown, Angela returned to her familiar routines. But the time inside the bubble had changed everything. The Queen had leaned on her most trusted aide during one of the most challenging periods of her reign. And Angela had responded not just with professionalism, but with compassion and dedication. The decision to allow the book was extraordinary in itself. Queen Elizabeth was famously guarded, careful to keep her personal life private and her public image intact. For decades, she had maintained a quiet dignity, speaking only when absolutely necessary and leaving interpretation to the public and press. And yet she gave Angela permission to write, to share, and to show another side of her, one that the world had never truly seen. Angela's memoir revealed not just how the Queen dressed, but how she lived. It covered the little moments that never made it into news stories, the private laughter, the habits, the routines, and the preferences that shaped the Queen's daily life. Angela shared how the Queen liked her tea, how she arranged her wardrobe, and how she would sometimes make spontaneous decisions that threw everyone's carefully crafted schedules into disarray. But one of the most surprising things Angela revealed was the Queen's quiet desire to be seen more informally. For decades, Queen Elizabeth had been portrayed in a very specific way: stoic, composed, perfectly dressed, and always in control. Most official photos showed her in formal wear, posing in carefully lit rooms, looking every bit the symbol of monarchy and tradition. That image served a purpose, especially in the early decades of her reign. But over time, something shifted. According to Angela, the Queen longed to be captured in a more relaxed and relatable way. She didn't want to abandon her royal image, but she did want to show that underneath the crown and the ceremonial clothing was a real woman. Someone who smiled, joked, and occasionally just wanted to put her hands in her pockets. This quiet wish led to one of the most memorable photographs ever taken of the Queen. Organized with the help of Angela, the private and informal photo shoot took place away from the usual palace backdrops. It was a chance for the Queen to appear as herself, without the stiffness of formal portraiture. In one of the shots, she stands casually with her hands tucked into her pockets, relaxed and slightly smiling. It was a simple pose, but in the world of royal image-making, it was revolutionary. For a monarch who had spent her life adhering to strict visual codes, even that small gesture broke new ground. The photo said, without words, that the Queen was willing to be seen as a person, not just a figurehead. Angela understood the weight of that image. She had spent years helping the Queen prepare for public appearances, ensuring that every detail sent the right message. Now, she had helped orchestrate a moment that felt deeply personal and deeply modern. It was a subtle shift, but it mattered. Beyond the photos, Angela's stories painted a portrait of a monarch who was far more approachable than many assumed. She described a woman who valued practicality, who didn't like waste, and who found joy in small acts of tradition. For instance, Angela explained how the Queen often reused fabrics from the royal storeroom. These weren't scraps. They were rolls of high-quality silk, lace, and brocade, some dating back decades. Rather than ordering new materials, the Queen frequently asked Angela to design new outfits using what was already available. That mindset extended to larger projects as well. One of the most talked about moments in Angela's book was the story of the royal christening gown. The original, created in 1841 for Queen Victoria's first child, had been worn by more than 60 royal babies over the generations. But by the early 2000s, it had grown too fragile to use. The Queen asked Angela to create a replica, one that honored the original but could withstand time. Angela didn't take the task lightly. She and her team researched every element of the gown, from the type of lace to the exact color of the fabric. The only problem was that the lace they sourced looked too new. It lacked the aged, cream-toned appearance of the original. So Angela turned to a very British solution: Yorkshire tea. She steeped the lace in tea to gently tint it, giving it the perfect vintage look. It worked. The gown that emerged was almost indistinguishable from the original and carried the same sense of history and meaning. It has since been worn by several royal children, including Prince George, Princess Charlotte, and Prince Louis. Stories like these made Angela's book resonate with readers across the world. People weren't just learning about royal clothing, they were seeing the humanity behind the monarchy. And the reaction was overwhelmingly positive. The memoir became a bestseller, praised for its warmth, honesty, and respectful tone. It gave the public something they rarely get from the royal institution: access to the emotional and personal layers beneath the surface. Still, not everyone within the palace approved. While the Queen had given her blessing, some senior courtiers were reportedly uncomfortable with the level of openness. For centuries, the British royal family had operated behind a veil of discretion. Staff were expected to stay silent, to serve without stepping into the spotlight. Angela's decision to write, and the Queen's support for it, challenged that long-held norm. There were whispers that Angela had grown too close, that her visibility was making others nervous. Some insiders felt she was crossing boundaries by sharing so much, even if it was done with care. But Angela remained firm. She wasn't revealing secrets or chasing celebrity. She was documenting a rare and personal chapter in royal history, and she had the Queen's trust. And that trust was everything. Angela's book didn't just change how people saw the Queen, it changed how they saw the monarchy as a whole. It showed that tradition and transparency could exist side by side, that a figure as iconic as Queen Elizabeth II could still have a laugh over a prank, a preference for certain fabrics, and a quiet desire to be seen as more than a symbol. Angela herself didn't come from privilege. She wasn't a court insider or someone groomed for the role. She came from a working-class background, and her rise through the palace ranks was the result of hard work, loyalty, and emotional intelligence. Her story, in many ways, is as surprising as the one she helped tell. The Queen's decision to allow Angela to speak was perhaps one of her most subtle but significant acts in her later years. It signaled a softening, a shift toward openness, and a recognition that personal stories, when told with care, have the power to connect people in a way that official statements and ceremonies never could. As time moves on and the royal family enters a new chapter, Angela's memoir stands as a unique record of a relationship built on trust, humor, and shared values. It shows the Queen not just as a leader, but as a person. And it reminds us that sometimes the most powerful stories come from those who stood just out of frame, watching, listening, and quietly helping history unfold.